Thanks for tuning in to another show in the Next Reel family of film podcasts.
Want to skip those ads and get early access?
Become a member at truestory.fm/join and discover all the other great perks that come with it. Welcome to CinemaScope, the podcast that digs deep into the gritty, honest world of film genres, subgenres, and movements. I'm Andy Nelson, your guide on this raw and uncompromising journey through the landscape of cinema. Today, we are venturing into the revolutionary realm of the British New Wave, a movement that tore down the walls of traditional filmmaking in the late 1950s and early 60s. Get ready to explore the kitchen sink dramas and the rebellious youth that defined an era as we uncover the unflinching stories that held up a mirror to post-war Britain. We'll delve into the lives of the working class, the struggles of the everyday, and the simmering social tensions that bubbled beneath the surface. So put on your best angry young man face and join me as we navigate the gritty streets and smoky pubs of the British New Wave. It's time to peel back the layers of this transformative movement and discover the truth behind the cinema that changed a nation. Let's get real. Joining me, I have a special guest, Professor David Forrest from the University of Sheffield. David is a professor in film and television studies and has written extensively about British cinema, social realism, and the works of key figures in the British New Wave. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you as somebody who really has studied and has a real sense of these films in this world. Before we really get started, though, I'd love to kind of get a sense from you as to kind of what actually spurred on your interest in the British New Wave.
That's a really good question. Actually, it was a housemate of mine. No one's ever asked me this question. I've been thinking about these films for a long time. So I just had to kind of reflect there for a moment. But I was at university with a fellow student. Actually, he studied American studies, but he took a module in British cinema, which I wasn't taking. And I was a little bit jealous of him. And we got chatting about some of the films that he'd been watching. And he said to me, "You have to watch This Sporting Life. It's right up your street." Yeah, I kind of explored that film and I watched it. We used to have a video library in our department at university. And you used to go, this is obviously pre-streaming, that's how old I am. And there were lots of off-air recordings. And it was a great joy to kind of really dive in and explore those recommendations. And so I watched This Sporting Life and, I realized that the more I read about it, that it was quite close to my own experience in terms of the geography of that film. So the writer was from just down the road from where I came from. And the culture that it depicts also felt weirdly familiar to me. Interestingly, that person who recommended it is now the music editor of the Guardian newspaper. And he's also one of the culture editors as well. He never writes about British cinema. So I feel like I've taken on the baton from him. But yeah, he was the person who got me into it. And yeah, from there, I just explored the films. And living where I do in the north of England, it's a really good place to explore the films. And as my academic career went on, and I worked on my master's dissertation on the British New Wave. And then I began to sort of take archival research quite seriously as my academic career started and started looking into the ways that archival research could really help shape our understanding of the New Wave.
I want to talk about kind of like where British cinema was in the early or late 40s, early 50s, kind of post-war that led to this. But before we do, I just want like a quick just an abbreviated definition of for people who haven't heard of the British New Wave as they are tuning into this, how do you just quickly kind of describe it to them?
So the British New Wave was a short-lived, but I think hugely impactful cycle of films made between 1959 and 1963, which focused on Northern English working class characters, locations, which emphasize locations. So we're using real locations, which was still a fairly revolutionary element, not just of British cinema culture, but more broadly of Europe, as I'm sure you're aware, and the world really. But that focus on the north, on regional actors as well. So that was a real point of distinction. So actors from the north of England and the Midlands of England as well, and actors from a working class background. So not only a focus on working class themes and topics and subject matter, but also creating a space for working class creativity. That is also reflected in the fact that these films, and a really distinctive element of these films, is they're adaptations, but they're also adaptations that lean quite heavily on new waves or parallel new waves in literature and in theatre. So rather than the adaptation as being a transactional process, there's something almost symbiotic, something almost that's kind of cross-generative about the adaptations, that the films inform the plays, that the plays inform the literature, inform the films. There's almost an ecosystem that we need to think of here. So I would see it as an integrated cultural movement with cinema as one output of it. I think the other things I would emphasise are that these are films that explore the inner life of working class characters, which was something which was distinctive and new in the British cinema up to this point, where typically working class characters had been categorised in quite homogenising ways and in quite generic and quite stereotypical ways. These were films that privileged and centred a particular kind of anger, sadness, melancholy. There were films as well that I think is probably an extension of that also explored a kind of open-endedness and ambiguity. In that sense, they can be seen as having something in common with the more defined kind of art cinemas and new waves that we know of elsewhere in Europe. So some elements there which are kind of culturally specific to Britain at the time and the British cultural traditions at that particular period, and industrial traditions, but also, and sociological specificity as well, but also a strong kind of connection with other European new waves.
You talked a little bit in there about kind of like the feeling that people were having, the angry tones and everything. How did we get here? So I guess, looking at what was going on in British cinema after the war that kind of made some of these people want to tell these more realistic stories of working people.
Yeah, I think it's not only about what was going on in British cinema, but what was going on in the British culture more broadly, in British popular culture. So I think this is what I mean about that, but we have to see this alongside movements in theatre. And to take one specific example, in many ways, the British New Wave begins in the theatre in the Royal Court in 1956 with Look Back in Anger. And John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger is seen as articulating a kind of, or of giving voice to that rupture that was occurring in Britain as it began to recognise its diminishing status as an empire. And with that was a feeling of the old ways of being and the old ways of seeing and the old kind of structures and the conservative traditions that had in many ways shaped British national identity up to that point were eroding. And that was kind of in many ways generated by a new class consciousness. And that new class consciousness was also emerging from a kind of a growing middle class that was where you were seeing working class university graduates who are kind of coming out of university as middle class. So gone to grammar school, passed the entrance exam to grammar school, entering into that cycle of social mobility, but realizing that the middle class was still alien to them, was still exclusive, but they were also strangers in their own working class. And so they were kind of at this position of anxiety and melancholy. And that very much reflected more broadly these shifting sands really in British society at the time, when we're getting this feeling of deep rupture. And in many ways, that play embodied that sense of rupture. And it was a play that kicked against theatrical traditions in Britain at the time. Then in the years that followed, that trickles into British cinema as well. And that parallel conservatism in British cinema is also challenged. And that's not to say that there aren't really subversive films being made in Britain in the 1950s, but that subversion is less pronounced. It's situated within more contained structures and within kind of quite theatrical frames as well. So that sense of realism is not necessarily as evolved as it is. So we begin to see these in the late 1950s, this real sense of the centre no longer holding, that real sense of fragmentation, and that's really reflected in the arts. There's also this flowering of working class writing in literature as well. These working class graduates who are beginning to have their voices heard in the cultural industries. And that anger, but I also think a sort of sadness or confusion about what has come before and what might be coming in the future is really powerfully captured. And that obviously gives rise to the British New Wave as a further expression of that.
there's a few things that you mentioned, and I feel like there's a lot of terms that get thrown about as it ties into British New Wave. Angry Young Men, you've kind of talked about that and how that was a very prominent literary movement that led very much into this and kind of helped define what the British New Wave was. Obviously, the French New Wave is happening like right at the same time, which is kind of where the name for this kind of pulled from. You could say some of it kind of probably pulled from Italian neorealism, which came before this.
Absolutely.
Kitchen sink realism is another term that I hear a lot. And the way that I kind of understand it is kitchen sink realism started around the same time, maybe a little beforehand, and kind of has continued after British New Wave ended. So if there's a Venn diagram, it's kind of like kitchen sink realism, and then the British New Wave is just a circle inside that bigger circle. Is that how you would kind of see that?
Yeah, I would. And I think actually we still hear kitchen sink talked about as a way of describing the continuing impulse to depict ordinary working class lives, not only in British film, but in British theatre, British television, and actually in British visual art, and in painting and in other forms of cultural expression.
Which I heard is where it started, right?
That's exactly right. That's what I was going to say. So it's another example really of how we can't look at the New Wave or indeed kitchen sink as medium specific. In many ways, these are wider impulses that work across multiple forms of expression, multiple medium. But so you're absolutely right to say that impulse persists. So an example of that can be found in a film that's sometimes talked about alongside the British New Wave, but kind of fails the purity test a little bit, if you like, is The L-Shaped Room, which is set in London, which is very much bound by quite narrow spaces in terms of it has that quite theatrical quality because of its focus on domestic and internal spaces. Nevertheless, one of the most recurring elements of that film is the kitchen sink, and the kitchen sink as a marker of ordinariness, as a marker of taking the audience to places that are not normally shown in film, at least not to that point. So I think you're right that the kitchen sink is a term which is used, I think, sometimes now pejoratively to describe a wider impulse of social realism. Yeah, I mean, something I've looked at in my kind of work on more contemporary realism is that you'll find critical discourse in the popular press, the mainstream critics will describe kitchen sink as something which is ordinary and is therefore stylistically unambitious.
Wow, interesting.
And I think that's also something that has afflicted the British New Wave as well. So it's a way of sometimes suggesting that the British New Wave its only value is in its kind of sociological reportage. And that denies the possibility to think about the various artistic questions that have been asked and the sense of these texts as kind of culturally valid or aesthetically valid in the same way that we might think of other more culturally fetid new waves. So
interesting, yeah.
And that's why there's some slippage around definitions of the British. But I certainly think you're right. The British New Wave sits within a wider sense, and also I think we can look at the idea of the kitchen sink stretching before the New Wave as well. Some really important realist films that come out of Britain in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Robert Hamer's It Always Rains on Sunday from 1947, set in Bethnal Green, working class part of London. Woman in a Dressing Gown, the J. Lee Thompson film from 1956, it's described as brief encounter in a council flat. These are really powerful expressions of a British working class life, but kind of bound by a set of conventions, dramatic conventions, studio system, which is perhaps less aligned with the more artistically liberal impulses that underpin the British New Wave. Nevertheless, there's a really powerful relationship between those and what we see in the New Wave.
Now, another term that I hear brought up quite a bit, and I think it's, I don't know, maybe its own movement that kind of was led into the British New Wave, is the free cinema movement, which is primarily documentary, I understand, but certainly a number of these directors that we're going to be talking about, Lindsay Anderson, Carol Reese, Tony Richardson, all were part of that, making some of these documentaries because they wanted to capture a sense of real life, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think taken together, the free cinema films are a really vibrant collection of expressions of kind of burgeoning artistic sensibilities amongst the different filmmakers that you've mentioned there, Richardson, Rice, Anderson, but also others around who are adjacent. So Lorenzo Mazzetti, Robert Vass, and I mentioned those two because respectively an Italian and Hungarian filmmaker making films in Britain and in dialogue with British film directors. And that just shows that what we were seeing was an opening up of what was previously quite a parochial national cinema to other voices. And so free cinema is great in enabling that. But I think more pragmatically, free cinema also evidences particularly Lindsay Anderson's ability to retrospectively market or draw together quite disparate elements using his critical skills and his skills as a writer and a journalist and a kind of someone who could amplify and foster a movement. That manifesto around free cinema was very much a retrospective document. A lot of the films that Anderson himself contributed to free cinema were sponsored by engineering firms, were funded by industrial families in the north of England. And so even though he was using those films to kind of express and develop his own talent as a documentary maker, as a documenter of working class life, same with Richardson, same with Carol Rice, with the Lambeth Boys, there was actually also often a commercial imperative or a kind of public service imperative as well. So those films are kind of wearing multiple hats. They are documentary films that in some cases, and some were funded by public subsidy, but some were also coming from things like engineering firms. Famously, Lindsay Anderson made a film about a regional newspaper in Wakefield, which is exactly the setting that 10 years later he would explore again in This Sporting Life. So there was, I think, as well in free cinema, an illustration of how those filmmakers were able to operate within various commercial settings and were able to still make work which felt that it reflected an aesthetic signature, an auteurist impulse, even though they were making films for a newspaper organisation, for an engineering firm, etc. So, yeah, but it was a space to explore, and those filmmakers at the same time were also beginning to develop as theatre directors as well. So they're making documentaries, they're also working in the theatre, and that's bringing them into dialogue with new writers, new actors. So there's this beautiful kind of melting pot of influences that's emerging around the 1950s that creates the foundations for the new wave.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a fascinating blend of a lot of these different things happening at this particular point in time. As we jump into, we're going to start talking about the films here in a minute, but I want to just get a sense before we do, of just looking at what have we not talked about that are kind of like what I'd say the core components of British New Wave. One thing that, I mean, certainly is the case for all the films we're talking about, they're all black and white. Are there any color British New Wave films, or is black and white kind of the thing?
Black and white is the thing. Are there any colour New Wave films? I mean, is an interesting question. There are none that would pass the purity test.
Right.
Which I should say, a colleague of mine, Melanie Williams, who I've done some writing with, has been really usefully probing the limits of the New Wave in some of her recent work, and talks about the idea that perhaps we are a little too rigid in our definitions of the New Wave. But one of the most interesting examples of a New Wave-like film in colour is probably the film Kes, Ken Loach's film from 1969, which is set in a very similar geographical location to many of the New Wave films. Thematically, subtly quite different, but what was interesting about that was that initially there was a desire to make a black and white film in line with that realist tradition, but the funders of the film, given where cinema was in the late 1960s, were keen to go with colour, and actually the film opens up a new chapter, I think, to realism because of the way it embraces colour. So yeah, social realism and colour is a really, really interesting topic. Another colleague at the University of Bristol, Sarah Street, has written extensively about this idea of colour versus black and white in terms of social realism as an aesthetic. And yeah, I certainly think there is something about the earnestness of black and white as an aesthetic that really is connected to the British New Wave and creates a sort of sense of timelessness. And I would also argue the idea of the New Wave films as objects of reflection and contemplation now, and how they recirculate as kind of objects of nostalgia or mourning for an idea of English or Northern English life, I think black and white really kind of enables that. So I'd certainly think that's a point of commonality. And of course, when we begin to see a divergence from that in the mid-1960s, the idea is that the British New Wave is in black and white, and you get on the train and you go to London and you get off the train and you're in Technicolor. So the North is always associated with black and white in that respect.
Interesting. I want to just get a sense from you, because another key element that you've been talking about is kind of like the regionality of this, as far as like Northern England and everything. And as somebody who is not very good with my English geography and everything, what makes that line different? Is it just because London is at the southern end of England, and it's kind of like as you go down, suddenly you're kind of like hitting the cosmopolitan area, and everything else is kind of more industrial, rural?
Yeah, I mean, it's about the North and South being quite distinctive economically and therefore culturally. So the North of England is where the foundations of the Industrial Revolution are laid. The North of England is where the work happens, and the North of England is where organised working class life, a life which is structured around the steel industry, the coal industry, the cotton industry, and these are geographically specific industries. And so we see in those industries a huge swathe of the population doing the same job. We see a social life and a cultural life which is connected to that specific job for generations, and a set of cultural practices, and therefore an emotional lexicon, if you like, which is absolutely shaped by the experience of work, of hard industrial work. And so the North is associated with the industrial working class, and the South is associated with a wider middle class. The South is associated with more economic prosperity. The South is associated with a degree of traditionally, at least, of political conservatism, where the organised left in Britain tended to be associated in the North of England, although that's very much changed in the last sort of 20 years. So the North-South divide is really powerfully inculcated and reinforced in these sorts of films, which is why that black and white colour point is an important one. And I think as well, though, it's really interesting that your observation is, you've been able to appreciate these films without necessarily having that. I think that one of the interesting things about the New Wave is that they operate without actually announcing their regional specificity. They instead operate as generically Northern. So for English audiences as well, for British audiences, that will have been the idea of the North and the South, and those sort of as more generic symbolic spaces rather than specific places would have been really important. And certainly no one talks about Wakefield in This Sport in Life. It's filmed across West Yorkshire. In Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, you've got someone, Albert Finney, from Salford, but he's in Nottingham. So he speaks with a Salford accent. In This Sport in Life, you've got Richard Harris, who's Irish, doing a kind of Yorkshire accent, and you've got Rachel Roberts, who's Welsh. What makes it significant is they're not Southern. And the idea is that cultural expression as well, and the cultural industries have been and continue to be located primarily within the South as well. That's what gives Britain its national expression. And so the politics of Northern representation are all the more important as an act of resistance to that. So hopefully that explains some of the geography and the kind of underpinning politics of that.
Yeah, it definitely helps kind of paint a picture of all of that. I mean, as I watch all of these, I'm like, maybe this is on the outskirts of London. I don't really know. So that that helps me get a sense as to like where I need to start thinking as I watch these. All right, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we will start digging into the films. Okay, we're back. So over the course of our conversation, we will be discussing 7 films that are great examples of the British New Wave. 5 of these will be part of the main show, and the other 2 will be included in the member bonus section. The 7 films are Room at the Top, Look Back in Anger, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, The Entertainer, A Taste of Honey, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, and This Sporting Life. If you'd like to hear the full conversation and learn more about membership, visit truestory.fm/join. That's TRUSTORY.fm/join. All right, we're going to start with Room at the Top from 1959, directed by Jack Clayton. In this groundbreaking film, ambitious young man Joe Lampton, played by Laurence Harvey, leaves his working-class background behind for a wealthy Yorkshire town. He becomes romantically involved with an unhappily married older woman, Alice, played by Simone Signoret, and a young upper-class woman, Susan. Joe must choose between love and his ruthless pursuit of success. We talked about kind of Look Back in Anger, which will be the next film we talk about, based on the play. The play came first, and that really kind of set things up. This film is kind of the groundbreaking one that kind of set the stage for what people would kind of come to expect in the British New Wave, right?
Yeah, and like Look Back in Anger, like The Entertainer, it falls into what I would categorise as the sort of first wave of the New Wave, in that what we can see is the sort of residual culture of a more classically oriented British cinema coming into dialogue with something new. And that residual culture is probably represented in some of the casting decisions here. So, Laurence Harvey, a Lithuanian British actor who tended to perform with a kind of received pronunciation British accent, is here attempting a West Yorkshire accent. And obviously there's a quite a shift in his performance. If you compare his performance, say, to Albert Finney's in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, just a year or two later. But I think what is on the more radical side is the use of location. We're beginning to see that expressive use of location and that kind of articulation of transition points and moments of change in British society reflected symbolically through the landscape. And I think we see that in really interesting ways in Room at the Top. I also think it's a very typical British New Wave film in its gender politics and in its framing of masculinity. But I think it's remarkably frank in its depiction of sexuality and of the kind of prison of masculinity and, in a sense, also the prison of a kind of conventional script of what it is to be a woman as well. And so in that sense, it's really setting in motion some of those themes around personal identity and the sense of the way that working class and middle class kind of cultural frames can really imprison characters and their anger and their expression. And I feel quite strongly there are very powerful, you can see the way that The Graduate, actually, that final scene, the scene on the bus in The Graduate, really reflects the kind of emptiness in face of the newlyweds in Room at the Top. That idea of an open-ended ending. Where will this go next? Even though there are sequels to Room at the Top, which Life at the Top, which is pretty terrible actually. But the other thing I would say as well, and is this is based on a novel, and it's based on a piece of working class literature. So it's that established cultural precedent, really, that you've got a working class writer in John Brain who's writing about the experience of a working class character, but also characterizing this social mobility. So I talked before about the discomfort that characterizes this new form of social mobility from one class to the next. And we see that really powerfully expressed in Room at the Top when Joe goes back to his family, to his auntie, and he doesn't feel at home in that environment anymore. But he's also not at home in the upper middle class terrain.
He doesn't really fit in anywhere. And I think that's, I don't know, it was interesting revisiting this film because there's definitely a sense of you can see why there's this anger, right? Like, I don't want to be part of that anymore. I want to be part of this now. I'm going to reject that, but I can't figure out how to get them to accept me. And that's kind of like what really is driving him. And it all centers around kind of this accidental pregnancy, which we will talk about quite a bit in these. There's a lot of accidental pregnancies over the course of these, but that's kind of the driving force that pushes the family to reluctantly accept him. Will they ever actually accept him for who he is? I don't know, probably not, but they're going to at least accept him enough because he is going to marry their daughter. But then there's this whole other relationship that he has with this married woman who is somebody that he actually loves, and he can't have that. So you're painting a picture of like why we have so much anger. And this is an interesting film, especially as we'll kind of move into the conversation, because I feel like of the films we're talking about and these angry young men that we're looking at, I can really understand what Joe's angry about here. Like, I see a lot of the things in his life that he's angry about. And then by the time we get to this sporting life, it's just like, he's just kind of angry, all the time angry. Can you really define what he's angry about?
That's interesting. Hold on to that thought, because
yeah.
that's fascinating. But yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I wonder if there's something there about, Room at the Top. It is more outward looking, perhaps, in its
I can see
appeal.
that, yeah.
It's less defined by its regionality and does feel like more of an expression of a kind of universal anger. I think that's a really interesting point. And I'd also add, though, thinking about those questions of regional specificity, the novel, his lover is not from France, Alice Aysgill. She's from Yorkshire. And there's a really interesting adaptation on the BBC a few years ago, which revisits Room at the Top and has Alice played by Maxine Peake, who's a Northern English actor. And it's a very, very different. And I mean, as much as the performance by Simone Signoret is incredible, I think there is something about taking her out of the class politics and having a French, a symbol of kind of exotic fascination outside of the British class system, who is also able to hold a mirror up to the British class system, but also able to look out to the world, which maybe broadens its appeal somewhat. So, yeah. But certainly, I think the other thing I'd add, though, about Room at the Top is it also sets in motion the kind of really problematic misogyny that exists throughout the new wave, and such that, the fate of Alice, the idea that you can't really live a free life as a woman in this world, and the ways in which women are continually traded as commodities. And that's really a feature of many of these films. And also the ways that the women are kind of obstacles to be overcome, or steps on the journey to kind of individual mobility for the characters. I think ultimately that's paid off somewhat by Joe's absolute kind of expression of melancholy, of horror almost at the end of the film, as he kind of robotically goes up the aisle. But yeah, it's nevertheless problematic in terms of its treatment of women.
Yeah, that's very true. And it's interesting because in the scope of these films, like you have incredible opportunities for these male actors to have some really juicy, interesting roles. And you can say, like, these are films about men, but the women in them are equally, like, they're given really exciting opportunities for performances as well, because they're up against these men who are just angry and fighting things. And I think that says a lot about kind of how Simone ended up playing Alice. And you can even say with Susan as well, like there's a sweet, naive sensibility with her trying to move through the world and falling in love and everything. And she's not really getting all of the things. She doesn't see everything. But by the time she's realizing that Joe had this relationship with Alice, you can see that she's trying to figure out how to work past that so that they can make a life together still.
Yeah, there's that pragmatism almost, which is a kind of coming of age for her. I think that point you make is really interesting about the space that is afforded female actors in these films and moments of conflict. And I can think that runs all the way through. There are all the way through the cycle, if you like, moments where women fight back against the interiority, the blindness, if you like, of the male characters, their absolute pursuit of self-interest. And there are some wonderful examples of that. There's a real powerful strain right from Simone Signoret all the way to Rachel Roberts in This Sporting Life. They hold the mirror up to the interiority of the male character. So I do feel that the films are not endorsing that worldview, but they are absolutely reflecting that these were times, worlds built for men, and women were also. So there are, sad young women, angry young men films, as much as I have a PhD student at the moment, actually. Part of a reading strategy for looking back at these films is to read the marginal depictions of women, to review British New Wave as films where we pay attention to women. And there's another, I'll just plug another colleague, Holly Price, has written a really excellent piece of work recently, looking at Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, through the lens of Doreen and Brenda, the female characters? What changes when we watch these films through the lens of the women who are marginalised, when we don't centre the male characters? And I think that's a really powerful way of exploring their continuing kind of legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's, you just mentioned it. Let's talk about Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, 1960, directed by Carol Reese. Arthur Seaton, played by Albert Finney, is a young factory worker in Nottingham, spends his weekends drinking, brawling, and engaging in an affair with a married woman. As he navigates his relationships and society's expectations, he begins to question the constraints of his working class existence and yearns for something more. Another one based on a novel from one of these writers capturing these stories. I think it was Alan, is it Silito? Is that how you say it?
Alan Silito, yeah.
Silito, okay. This and Albert Finney, in like an incredible breakout performance, were really kind of capturing a sense of like, you've already mentioned like these real locations. We're seeing him working in this factory. I never was quite sure of what those little pieces that they're making, but they're putting together little of things, and so we're getting a kind of sense of that world. And the director having been part of that documentary movement, we're really seeing like some moments here that just feel very documentary-esque.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you get that aerial shot of the workers leaving the factory, which could be in the British New Wave, it could be in Italian neo-realism, could be free cinema.
That could have been the cinema verite from 1896, right? Workers leaving the factory, right?
Exactly that. Yeah. So, but at the same time, as almost the counter to that, you've got Arthur speaking. We hear his inner monologue. So immediately we have that subjective narration alongside this objective depiction of his setting. And so I think there's a really interesting point of rupture here, or at least a development in the new wave, where we have Saturday Night and Sunday Morning is taking us stylistically, formally into the inner world of a character. And that inner world isn't used much, that we don't hear that voiceover much. We hear it again when he's beaten up by the soldiers, and when we have some of the most iconic lines in the film. I should say the factory is a bicycle factory. That's where the bicycles were built in Nottingham. Silito himself had experience of that factory. So that's that kind of regional specificity.
I gotcha. Okay.
It's not signaled to us, and I think you would have to. So it's not therefore a qualification for engaging with the film.
We're not going down the assembly line watching
factory,
it,
right? Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not about, and that's the thing. Arthur's a fairly exceptional figure, and that's another way of foregrounding that through that voiceover. The way he talks about the people around him. We do get the only black character in the film is one of the other factory workers that he identifies at the outset. They don't have any lines, but he describes him and he shows his affection for him. But then we go into the Johnny Dankworth score, that jazz score, Johnny Dankworth soundtrack. We Are the Lambeth Boys, which was Carol Rice's contribution to free cinema, probably, in my opinion, the most complete of the free cinema films. But then he also makes films like The Servant, Morgan, a Suitable Case for Treatment, which is Carol Rice's other film. So Johnny Dankworth and there's other figures that are kind of work across the new wave here. We have Alan Silito, who also writes Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, which is a key new wave film 2 years after. That's based on one of his novels, but it stars Tom Courtenay. You also have Finney's made his debut just a few months earlier in The Entertainer, which is the follow-up from the Woodfall follow-up, Tony Richardson follow-up to Look Back in Anger. So all these connections are starting to be here, but this film also feels very, very different. And I think that captures how the new wave is both a loosely affiliated cycle, but also we need to look at these films as individual films. So yeah, it's a remarkable statement, and it's the most successful, I think, and the most kind of well-liked and universally liked film. I think it's in many ways the easiest 80 minutes. It really has those new wave tropes, the landscape shots. For example, there's really iconic images of failed rebellion towards the end when he's throwing the stone. But as I say, it also has these moments of kind of interiority and these moments of fragility. And this idea that these figures are different from other generations. Just to say, I think the most powerful moment for me in the film is when Arthur is sat at the back of the room and looks out at his parents, and they're both tied to the television, something we haven't talked about yet, is the way that these films depicted an anxiety about new forms of entertainment, mass consumerism, and the ways in which that was kind of eroding traditional forms of working class conviviality and community. You know, the way that Arthur is with his auntie, who's in the pub, who's much more open, much more conversational, and much franker in her discussion of the problems that obviously Brenda's having, whereas his parents glued to the television, and he sees that sense of there are two moments of kind of working class life there that are contrasted against each other.
And we also get, as kind of the film kind of comes to its close, not to spoil a movie from 1960, but here we are. Brenda chooses to he gets beat up. She stays with her family, and Doreen decides, she finds out about all this, but decides, okay, let's stay together. Let's still be together. Kind of like Room at the Top. We can still find a way to make this work. Sure, you were sleeping with another woman and you got her pregnant, but let's still, the ending of the two, it actually kind of feels hopeful, right? The two of them sitting on the hillside overlooking kind of you can see all the new developments and everything. And there's, you said he kind of throws the rock. He kind of the end of the rebellion is right there. And he now is settling down.
And one reading of that is that he is submitted to a kind of gendered consumerism. So the way of reading that is through Doreen, her mother. They live in one of those newer council houses. Arthur is living in those tight terraced houses where everybody on the street, even though you're shooting them through your window. And there's a fear, I think, about that more privatised working class life in those new estates. And so that stone, there is a submission, and he says something like, "There won't be the last one I throw either." And there's again an ambiguity there, because are we witnessing the futility of those acts of resistance? He's been telling us all the way through that he's different. He's been telling us all the way through that he's not like the rest. But at the end of the film, he submits, arguably, to a life just like any other. When he talks about it not being the last stone he throws, does that mean he's literally just going to throw stones to satisfy his desire for resistance? And again, I agree with you. There is a degree of hope there, but there's also, with Doreen, it's hardly happily ever lived after. It's another example of a pragmatic accommodation of human beings are messy and complex. And maybe I don't love Arthur, maybe I do, but we're together now and that's enough. And that kind of accommodation is something that we see all the way through the New Wave, just characters making do.
It definitely it paints a picture for, I guess, of Northern England, of just the grouping of people in this societal class of just we just got to work our way through this. And
their inability to escape, right?
Yeah, so, yeah.
That's why something like Billy Lie is really important and interesting, because it really makes that clear that even characters with aspirations to escape can't do it.
Still can't,
physically can't do it. Joe Lampton, it's a similar desire for that mobility, but there isn't that. The escape there would have been with Alice, and when we see him happy and when we see him fulfilled, are in those stolen moments with Alice. They're not in the path that is laid out for him.
Even though he's getting what he always thought is what he wanted, the financial rewards, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Let's continue our talks about Tony Richardson. Talk about A Taste of Honey from 1961. In this one, Jo, played wonderfully by Rita Tushingham, a vulnerable teenage girl in working-class Manchester, navigates a complex life with her neglectful, free-spirited mother, Helen. After a brief romance with Jimmy, a black sailor, Jo becomes pregnant and then finds support in her gay friend, Jeffrey, forming an unconventional family unit. Adapted from Sheila Delaney's play, we're getting a lot of new things here that we haven't really talked about. We've got, first of all, we've got a female protagonist, a young woman who's still, I don't know, she was just finishing school, I guess was kind of what I was getting. We have interracial relationships. We've got homosexuality. We've got single motherhood. It feels like this film is really pushing a lot of boundaries.
And fascinatingly, it is not necessarily about any of those things, right? It's not issue led.
No, right.
It's a remarkable film, and I think feels like I described Saturday Night and Sunday Morning as marking that transition. Well, Taste of Honey takes it to the next level. Its use of location is so beautifully expressive, I would say. You know, walking along the canals, escapes the countryside, the temporary escapes the countryside, which features in a number of the New Wave films, is really powerfully expressed here. The scene under the arch, the viaduct, you know, with Jeff and Joe, the framing of that dialogue about being extraordinary, that sentiment about what it is to be extraordinary despite your situation, the embrace, therefore, of otherness, but also the silence of Jeff's sexuality, the fact that he can't express it, the fact that he exists in the shadows, in the margins, the ways that he feels that he has to perform heterosexuality and the heterosexual function of being a provider. It really does come beautifully to a head in this film, I think. And also we're seeing a kind of a different form of stardom. You know, Rita Tushingham is a new kind of British actor. I've talked about the importance that these are regional, you know, coming from outside of London, working class backgrounds. Here we see a challenge to the very narrow version of British womanhood, if you like, that's portrayed in the British cinema up to this point, a British girlhood, indeed. This is someone who almost embraces that awkwardness, that otherness, and in the process makes something remarkable, poetic in the film. And I think as well that Sheila Delaney's writing is really important here. So I've described the way that the New Wave needs to be seen as a writer's cinema. I think that's no more. I mean, we've just talked about a few other Tony Richardson films, which feel quite staid in comparison to this. I wonder how much that is also because of Delaney's own kind of background in Salford. It's filmed in Salford. That's where she wrote the play, inspired by those landscapes, and they're recreated faithfully in the film. But also a natural ear for the voice of those people and the words of those people in that community, in that particular community, and therefore the lyricism that comes from the dialogue, I think, is remarkable. And in Taste of Honey, it's about the lyricism against those sorts of backdrops. And that's why the film has been mined so heavily by Morrissey, you know, and other cultural figures, because it does capture something of the poetic life of working class communities.
Yeah, it really does. All right, let's talk about, again, more Tony Richardson, big name in this movement here. The loneliness of the long-distance runner. In this film, Colin Smith, a rebellious youth played by Tom Courtenay, is sent to a reformatory after a petty crime. There, he finds solace and freedom in long-distance running, catching the attention of the institution's governor, who sees Colin's athletic ability as a means to boost the reformatory's reputation. As Colin trains for an important competition, he must decide whether to conform or maintain his defiant spirit. I think this one really stood out for me the most as the person who just said, you know, fuck it, this is great. I'm just gonna keep fighting this system, right? That's where we end up with this guy who's like, I don't know, he's given all of these opportunities, and you know, as the governor kind of keeps telling him, like, you can make something of yourself. We're really getting a sense in this film of how society in general sees athletes, and like they'll funnel as much money as they can into these athletic programs because it's going to help them make a name for themselves as kind of a university, or in this case, a reformatory. He has opportunity. He's great at running, but he doesn't want it.
He rejects it. Yeah, I mean, gosh, there's so much to say about this film, but I think your point there about rebellion is really interesting. It comes back to the point I've been making about understanding the writer's contribution to the New Wave. So let's see this as what it is, which is the work of Sillitoe as much as it's the work of Richardson. So the same writer who is behind Saturday Night and Sunday Morning is also behind Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. So it's this a fiercer rebellion than perhaps the one that we see in A Taste of Honey. Is a different kind of rebellion to the one that we see in This Sport in Life. And so it's more politically sharp, I think. You know, it's significant that his father is a trade unionist, and the death of the father, this links us back to Look Back in Anger, is seen as also a death of a particular kind of political sensibility. The mother and her association with consumerism is also something we can see in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. You know, that strange scene when she when she's buying everything, and she's edited almost like an advert. So yeah, there's a lot there. It was politically edged because I think of because of Silito's work. I think as well this is something that is the most like the Nouvelle Vague in its style. It's been compared to 400 Blows in terms of obviously its setting, but I think very much it's examination of subjectivity or embrace of devices around subjectivity. It's use of flashback structures, but also I think the presence of Redgrave is really powerful in the same way that, as we've talked about, the presence of Olivier in The Entertainer, this sense of multiple generations. Also, Colin is a different kind of man to what we see in these other films. Tom Courtenay is another working class British actor from Hull this time, which is over in Humberside, the east part of Yorkshire. He's someone who is physically less pronounced and less assertive and embodies a different form of masculinity than what we've seen. And he'll continue to explore that in Billy Liar. So yeah, it's in some ways, I think, quite an experimental film, but as you described, its power lies in its rejection of that linear notion of success. The opportunity is afforded him, but he doesn't want to take it. It's significant too that this is about a public school, a fee-paying school, which comes to the Borstal, and that really does distill the idea of class. I'd just add Silito despised sport, and he wrote about sport as an expression of capitalism, whereas this Sporting Life, you've got someone who himself played sport, who wrote it, and who, as much as it's about the similar problems of sport, if you like, the way that sport can be commoditized, is very much coming from a different place.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it. Let's end our conversation talking about This Sporting Life, Lindsay Anderson's film from 1963. In this, Frank Machen, a bitter young miner, played with raw intensity by Richard Harris, finds escape from his working class existence through a rugby league. As he rises to local stardom, he begins a tumultuous relationship with his widowed landlady, Mrs. Hammond. Frank's aggressive playing style and brash personality bring him success on the field, but create turmoil in his personal life. Richard Harris is fantastic in this. And again, I guess as a way to kind of close this conversation, I'm curious, going back to where we started with Room at the Top and a sense of why he's so angry, Richard Harris, he even says at one point when he grabs Pop's arm, when he's really angry about something, and he just grabs his arm and Pop is like, ow, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? And then he lets him go and he's just like, I don't know. That's kind of a big part of who Frank is.
So I think this is a really complex question. And I think one of the ways that we explore it is by thinking about the different personalities that are involved in the film. So we'll begin with David Storey. He's the film's writer. He was the son of a miner from Wakefield. He played rugby league professionally. So he knew that world, but he was also an art student at the Slade School of Fine Art, which is so he's experiencing that social mobility. So he goes to London, he paints. It's the most prestigious art school in Britain. Then he goes up north to continue to play rugby league, which is the most brutal working class sport you can possibly get. So I guess the analogy would be, imagine if American football had slightly different rules, and you had in one part of the country them playing a much harder and more aggressive form of American football, and without any of the helmets and things like that, and they were just beating the crap out of each other. That's kind of rugby league, right? That's crude, right. but there we are. So he's in this split world, and he can't ever really make sense of that split world. And what his artistic project is, beginning with a novel of This Sporting Life, is he begins to examine these tensions between what he called the world of the mind and the world of the body. And he felt that his working class experience absolutely captured that and gave articulation to that impossible duality. And so This Sporting Life is his attempt to think about the physical side of that duality and how he expressed it. And so for Frank, he is this, Mrs. Hammond describes him as a great ape on a football field, or they have that discussion. He's an animal. He does not have the language. He does not have the emotional lexicon to talk about his feelings. It's about an expression of that kind of, we talk about toxic masculinity now. That's often about, it's not men not having the words and language to talk about how they're feeling. And you talked earlier on about how these films often express something unspoken. This Sporting Life, that's very much the case. Yeah, so on Story's behalf, he's trying to think about this form of violent masculinity that he finds in that culture, shaped by institutions like coal mining, rugby league, where men have to be a particular kind of man, where men have to perform masculinity in a particular kind of way. At the same time, you've got Lindsay Anderson, who doesn't really care about rugby league, but is interested in the tragedy of not being able to give articulation and to your feelings, and he was interested in that in many ways. But one of the readings that is, I think, quite convincing is that as a gay man who's in the closet throughout his life, he finds something quite powerful in particularly Mrs. Hammond, actually, the landlady, who carries with her this kind of funereal quality of never being able to find happiness again.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But he, of course, as well, was obsessed with Richard Harris. And Richard Harris was well aware of that. And Richard Harris manipulated and bullied him, and they had a violent relationship.
Interesting.
Which was expressed, on set as well. So all of this is at play. And of course, Rachel Roberts as well, as someone who was kind of haunted by quite significant challenges around addiction and other elements of her life. She did not have an easy life by any stretch of the imagination. So all these kind of creative figures, if you like, are bringing themselves these unspoken dimensions to the film. And I think, we talked about male friendship, and there's that moment with Frank and Maurice when we see their hands holding it, and we see the tears in Frank's eyes. He can't express his feeling. He touches Maurice and he asks if he could ever be loved. And that is a really revolutionary moment in terms of the articulation of kind of working class emotion, really. The other thing to say, there's a reason he's called Machin. Machin is, for Story, very close to machine. And I've looked at the early drafts of his novel, and he's called Arthur in the novel. It's called Arthur in the novel. It changes to Frank because they want to break the association with Arthur from Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. So it's Frank Machin. Yeah. But originally it's Arthur, art for short, art machine, the two sides of Story's world. Yeah. The artist and the working class machinery. Right. And that is embodied in the emotional tenor of the film.
That is fascinating. Well, it's a fantastic film. All of these are, and I'm thrilled that we had a chance to talk about it. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to chat about the British New Wave's evolution and its impact. We've kind of gone through, from one end to the other, looking at a number of films from the British New Wave. What happened? Why did it come to an end? Is it just like these filmmakers, suddenly it's like, it's not Hollywood, but like, the studios were calling and saying, hey, we want you to give you a bunch of money to go make Tom Jones. Like, is that what happened?
Well, that's certainly one of the answers. And, you see the evolution of Woodfall and Tony Richardson. Tom Jones is a hugely successful film. The film where we've been discussing, This Sporting Life, is not. And actually that's Woodfall bid for that, but actually ended up with the Rank organisation, and it was a commercial failure. The commercial performance of the British New Wave generally was mixed. The films that were able to be delivered on a low budget but maximise their profits, like Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, for example, make sense in the context of British cinema. There's very much, in terms of economic viability, there's very much a sense that when we get to This Sporting Life, the commercial appeal of these films is fading. An anecdote I'd use to illustrate this is that when Tony Garnett, who's the producer of Kes, which is, as I mentioned, a really important kind of post-New Wave film, is trying to get finance for Kes. It's a film set in the north of England. He's told two things. It's about a working class boy and a bird who trains and nurtures a bird, right? He's told two things. The wrong kind of bird. So the idea is that the only thing you can get is, so bird meaning a woman, right? So it needs to be a film about a woman. Or we've done the North. So that idea that the North of England is a genre, really. And that's by the end of the British New Wave. And actually the evidence backs that up. I talked about Billy Liar as an important moment. Julie Christie, as it goes, Julie Christie went to London. Tom Courtenay stayed at the end of Billy Liar. And then we have Darling. John Schlesinger makes Darling, which is a really successful film in London, which has Laurence Harvey as well. Uses some of the aesthetic devices, but opens up to a different geographical setting. And we begin to see films that really embrace the cultural changes that we were seeing in London. So in a sense then, the north of England becomes this quite static, quite nostalgic place that, to come back to where we started, only really exists in black and white.
Yeah, interesting.
So, I mean, I'd also say, though, that we begin to see a flowering of social realism in television as well. And we begin to see the tradition of the television play emerging, which creates a space for this kind of storytelling and this kind of regional storytelling. But that's certainly not the case in the British cinema as it opens up to the world. And yeah, a film like Tom Jones, same actor, same director, but very, very different subject
very
matter.
Different,
shows
yeah.
what could be achieved. Similarly, the films of Carol Rice, as well as Tony Richardson. So for Lindsay Anderson, it's very different. He makes If, and there's a kind of continued commitment to a kind of art cinema, if you like.
Well, and I guess just speaking of where it goes and what it inspires, I mean, you mentioned social realist films, and I think that certainly that kind of has continued, inspiration from what these filmmakers were doing in the works of Mike Leigh, and you already mentioned Ken Loach, and you could also see it in like some of the Cool Britannia films and like Trainspotting and stuff like that. Like they're still trying to capture a sense of this, and even you could argue that there's some sense of influence on like the American New Wave in the 60s and 70s with like Easy Rider and Five Easy Pieces is probably a big one, and even the Czech New Wave. So you can see some of the influences of this, not just the French New Wave. You always hear that's such an influence, but I think the British New Wave also is probably likely influential on where a lot of these things would pop up.
Yeah, I'd love to know if Scorsese, De Niro, when they were making Raging Bull, looked at the sporting life, because I think there's some really interesting symmetries with those films. And of course, John Schlesinger works in Hollywood as well, and he's successful in Hollywood. So there's some definite crossovers there. And you mentioned the legacy social realism in British cinema never goes away. It just shifts and changes and responds to what's come before. So I talked about, we begin to see a filmmaker like Ken Loach becoming more prominent in the 1960s, and certainly in the 1970s up to the 1990s, begins to develop a form of social realism which is opposed to the kind of ambiguous, emotional, poetic qualities of the New Wave, and is instead much harder edged and much more politically didactic. And that's, but then again, I think that's been responded to by filmmakers like Shane Meadows, Clio Barnard, Andrea Arnold, who have taken British cinema back to a more new wave, landscape focused, focus on the child, focus on their teenager, focus on these characters negotiating their in-between spaces.
Even something like Lynn Ramsey's Ratcatcher.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Ratcatcher is, in a way, the film that starts the new cycle of new wave cinema, and then
the new wave,
Fish Tank, the new wave, definitely. Fish Tank would be, I'd say, an American Honey, and Andrea Arnold's films. Yeah, her most recent film, Bird, for example, is very much in dialogue with films like Kes that I've talked about. Clio Barnard, her film, The Selfish Giant, is a reworking of those kind of northern working class films of the 1960s.
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating movement, absolutely worth studying and digging into. And I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but
absolutely, yeah.
It's just been great. Thank you so much for joining me to have this conversation, David.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Do you have any plugs, anything that you want people to check out?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to my website, a few of the articles and book chapters that are on there are freely available to people. Also, my book from last year under the British Film Institute's BFI Film Classics series on Kes, if you're interested in exploring this further, came out last year and is available across the world and not just in the UK. So check that out. And the only reason I plugged that is because a lot of the work that I produce is academic writing, which is expensive. It only sits in university libraries, and thankfully that's a trade book and is at a reasonable price. So and is very well illustrated by the British Film Institute with lots of great stills. And to me, that's a really interesting kind of post-New Wave film. So I would encourage folks to check that out.
Well, if I do a conversation about the post-New Wave, I'll call you up and we can chat more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great.
All right. Well, David, again, thank you so much.
Good man. Thank you.
Next month, we'll be trading one post-war landscape for another as we journey from the industrial heartland of northern England to the sun-scorched vistas of the American West. That's right, we're exploring the post-war Western, a genre that, much like the British New Wave, grappled with the profound changes and uncertainties of a world reshaped by conflict. In this new frontier, the lines between hero and villain blur, and the mythic tales of the Old West collide with the harsh realities of a changing nation. So dust off your spurs, saddle up, and get ready to ride into a new era of the Western genre, where the echoes of war and the challenges of modernity reverberate across the vast expanses of the American landscape. Thank you for joining us on CinemaScope, part of the True Story FM Entertainment Podcast Network. Music by Orcus and Lance Conrad. Find us and the entire Next Reel family of film podcasts at truestory.fm. Follow @TheNextReel on social media, and if you're enjoying the show, please leave us a rating and review wherever you listen. And as we part ways, remember, your cinematic journey never ends. Stay curious.
Hello and welcome to Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys. My name is Hunter. In this podcast, I'll be joined by a different guest each week to discuss a classic Western movie or TV show. I've been a fan of classic Westerns for as long as I can remember, and in recent years, they've become very nostalgic for me. I love the aesthetic, the tropes, and I love seeing different filmmakers' takes on them. At their best, they're incredibly entertaining, rewatchable, and some of my all-time favorite movies are Westerns. We'll mostly focus on Western movies made in Hollywood, but we'll also be covering spaghetti Westerns, and one thing I'm very excited to get into are Western TV shows. I've got some amazing guests coming on the show, film professors, historians, and podcasters. And Tumbleweeds and TV Cowboys is part of the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network, and many guests on the show will be from other shows on the network. Thanks for listening.